Welcome to Paleo Talks, episode 15. We are here today with Dr. Bobby Bosenecker, and we're going to be learning about something particularly exciting, I think, and that is some giant dolphin material. And we haven't talked at all about cetaceans yet, so this is pretty exciting for us. I want to remind everybody we're coming to you from the Center of Excellence in Paleontology at East Tennessee State University, Johnson City, where we also oversee the Gray Fossil Site. And the fossils that Bobby's going to talk with us about today are actually like 25 million. So 20 million years older than the Gray Fossil Site for some perspective on that. I want to introduce my co-host, David Moscato. He is our science communicator, and he always reminds us sort of how the program is going to work. David, if you do that.
Sure thing. So as usual, Blaine in just a moment is going to get Bobby started, and our guest is going to lead through their presentation. Blaine will ask him some prompting questions, and then about halfway through, so like 25 minutes in or so, I'll chime in with a reminder to people who are watching to ask questions. So once we get to that point, we'll start taking questions from you, the audience. So if you're here on Facebook, you can go ahead and start putting your questions in the comments at that point. If you're watching, but you can't leave comments on Facebook for whatever reason, go to the Gray Fossil Site Twitter or Instagram page. I'll be also checking those to see if we get any additional questions coming in that way.
All right. Well, welcome, Bobby.
Thank you, Blaine.
And I think this is the hottest off the press paper that we've gotten to talk about as well. We're talking about published this month, correct?
Just 2 weeks ago yesterday, I think. Yeah.
All right. Very good. Well, if you wouldn't mind just going ahead and introducing yourself a little bit more and tell us about your background.
So I grew up in Northern California. Started collecting marine mammal fossils and shark teeth when I was in high school. And I had always intended on studying dinosaurs, but I realized after I got to Montana that there were way more questions involved with just trying to figure out the sequence of assemblages, all sorts of new species, how marine mammal fossils are preserved, so the field of taphonomy. So I went into a master's thesis at Montana State University, same as my undergrad, doing marine mammal preservation, taphonomy, etc., and working on the taxonomy of some baleen whale fossils I had collected during my master's catapulted me into doing a PhD at the University of Otago in New Zealand on Eomystacetids, which are the earliest functionally toothless baleen whales and the first ones that are obligate filter feeders. And they're from the Oligocene period, or epoch, same time period as Ankylorhiza, which I'm about to start talking about. And that set me up pretty well for working here at College of Charleston with one of the largest assemblages of early diverging mysticetes and odonnocetes anywhere in the world.
Are there cetacean fossils in New Zealand, or is that the person you went to work with, or both?
Yes to both.
Okay.
So there are only a few productive Oligocene cetacean-bearing localities worldwide because the Oligocene is generally a period of low sea level. And most deposits from the Oligocene are offshore and underwater. There are continental exposures of Oligocene cetacean-bearing rocks in New Zealand, one beach in Australia, pretty abundantly here in South Carolina, a couple spots in North Carolina, northern Florida, and Pacific Northwest, a few places in Eastern Europe, and the Caucasus Peninsula, and that's basically it.
So, are they usually associated with a transgressive sequence?
Yes.
Okay. Well,
I will note though that the sequence stratigraphy for most of these localities is pretty poorly understood. Okay. Hence my hesitation to answer.
Right. Well, if you wouldn't mind, Bobby, going ahead and pulling up your presentation and sharing it.
All right. Let's give me 1 sec. My laptop is a bit elderly, if you will.
I think most of us who work on mammals are not working on marine mammals, and we're much more inland focused. And so this is pretty exciting for us to get to learn more about this evolution of these groups. I know you love the question of, the difference between dolphins and porpoises and whales too.
I'm gonna try and drag this over so it's most out of the way as possible. And if we get to a slide where this bar on the left is covering things, I'll just go ahead and try and move it as needed. So,
Okay.
All right,
Yeah,
here's
go
the
ahead.
talk.
Go ahead.
We're talking today about the giant dolphin and Chilorhiza Tiedemanni, and a little bit about what it means for the evolution of feeding ecology and locomotion in early echolocating whales, Odonnell Seat. And I did this, I co-authored this with Morgan Churchill, Emily Buchholz, Brian Beatty, and Jonathan Geisler. And we published this 2 weeks ago in the journal Current Biology. All right, there we go. So let me move this out of the way a little bit more. There we go. Okay, so cetaceans first. Why is this covered up on the bottom? That's frustrating.
If you go to the
That's
top
all right.
under view options, you might be able to have a different option there.
I'm not going to waste that. I'm not going to waste time. All right, so we'll just have to deal with it. So cetaceans evolved from artiodactyl, even-toed ancestors in the early Eocene, and we get the first completely ocean-going whales by the end of the Eocene. Animals like Syntheocetus here, which is a basilosaurid whale. They have heterodont teeth, big meat-slicing molars in the back, highly reduced vestigial hind legs. They cannot echolocate, they cannot filter feed, and they are thought to be the common ancestor of modern baleen whales, the mysticetes on the upper left, and the toothed whales, or echolocating whales, the Odonnell Seats on the upper right. Historically, there's been little attention paid to what happened between the Eocene and the Miocene because these Oligocene fossils, as I mentioned, are quite rare. Starting in about 1900, some scrappy fossils were starting to be discovered. Actually, some were found much earlier, as early as the 1840s, but it wasn't really until the 1970s that lots of anatomically informative skulls and skeletons were being discovered here in Charleston, largely because of the housing boom, and a lot of these fossils were discovered literally during the grading of construction sites and excavating stormwater retention ponds. So fossils like Coronodon, which we named in 2017, that's an early baleen whale that still had teeth. That's a beautiful example of a transitional fossil. And it's really like 80% Archaeocete, 20% baleen whale. It really looks similar to Syntheocetus. And then we've got transitional dolphins like Xenophus on the right-hand side. So we have 2 rock units here. I'll talk about those more in a minute, but basically the fossils here tell us a lot about the origin of filter feeding and the origin of echolocation. That's if you only look at the heads, and historically it's been assumed that after the mysticetes and Odonnell Seats diverged from one another, not a whole lot happened behind the neck. And part of that is twofold. One, we didn't really have a whole lot of good skeletons showing the postcranial skeleton. And 2, paleocetologists, or whaleontologists as I prefer, who work on early Neoceti happen to be headhunters. So it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that you're not gonna, if you're a headhunter and you don't have very many fossils to begin with, it's kind of gonna reinforce that, and then you may not necessarily notice much going on behind the neck if you're not looking for it. So we have this spectacular collection here at Mace Brown Museum of Natural History, originally College of Charleston Natural History Museum, hence the retained acronym. We have lots of fossils from the southeast, and our biggest emphasis here is Cenozoic marine vertebrate fossil assemblages, with an even greater emphasis still on cetacean evolution. So, and then this image in the middle, that is our evolution of telescoping exhibit. So showing the migration of the blowhole.
What do you have in the lower right?
That is Myocetus inuus. It's a cast of an Eocene four-legged whale, protocetid, from the Middle Eocene of Pakistan. Protocetids are the group of whales that begat basilosaurids, if you will. So both basilosaurids and protocetids are paraphyletic grades rather than monophyletic clades. All right, so I'm going to move this around a little bit. So actually, maybe we don't need to see each other's faces at all during this anyway. No offense. I'll bring it back out if it's convenient. So these are some of our beautiful early Odonnell Seat and Mysticetes fossils. You've already seen a picture of Coronodon. That's on the lower left. That's about a meter-long skull, an animal about the size of a killer whale. Xenorophids are on the lower right. I'll have to take my word for it. But from left to right in that image, we have Xenoropus, which is the largest xenoropid. The white one just to the right of that is Cotylocara, the first dolphin for which we had any evidence of echolocation. Echovenator is the brown one to the right of that. And Echovenator is the first dolphin, the earliest known dolphin for which we have evidence of a cochlea fine-tuned for hearing high-frequency sounds used for echolocation. So Cotylocara had craniofacial evidence of that. Echovenator has hearing evidence that it could echolocate. So between those two, they tell us that Xenorophids, the earliest diverging Odonnocetes, were capable of echolocating. And then the one on the lower right is Inermerostrum, which is a bizarre, tiny, short-snouted, toothless suction-feeding dolphin, and quite probably the smallest cetacean ever to live, clocking in at about 1.2 meters long. On the upper right is a Wypatia, the spear-toothed dolphin, and Blaine had that question earlier about New Zealand. Wypatia metaphenua, which is the type, genus, and species of the family, is from the Oligocene, discovered by my PhD advisor about 1990 and published in 94 from the Oligocene of New Zealand. And then on the upper left is genus Y, now known as Ankylorhiza, and we'll be talking about that specimen.
So, Bobby, both of those on the top have incisor-like teeth that are sticking out anteriorly.
Yes.
Is that something common with these early cetaceans? Is it something that exists in any living cetaceans?
It's sort of a poorly known, like awkward teenage stage that early Odonnocetes went through. So there are some Miocene stem Odonnocetes like Squalodon that have that condition still. And there's a couple of early delphinoids that are, close to the ancestry of belugas, porpoises, and oceanic dolphins that have a couple of procumbent teeth at the front. But it hasn't really ever been, the function of these teeth has never been adequately examined to my knowledge. I will be talking about it more in a few minutes.
Thank you.
So altogether, from the Oligocene of Charleston, we have nearly 30 genera and species of mid to late Oligocene cetaceans. Most of them are Odonnocetes. We have a handful of baleen whales, two of which are toothed baleen whales like Coronodon, and Coronodon's unnamed big brother or big sister, which was just nicknamed Haas. And then there are two eomysticeted baleen whales, Eomysticetus and Micromysticetus, which are the group I studied for my PhD. And we'll be hearing more about those in the next couple of years. So there's a very diverse, similar in diversity to modern cetacean assemblages, or slightly more probably exacerbated by time averaging. But unlike modern whale assemblages, they are extremely Odonnell Seat skewed, which we have no explanation for. So when did fossils start to be discovered in Charleston? Relatively early. So as Chris Widga can tell you, one of the first positively identified vertebrate fossils in North America were teeth of mammoths found on the Stono plantation here in Charleston. Their identity was unknown to the white plantation owners, but the enslaved Africans on the Stono plantation correctly identified them as elephant teeth. This was in the, I believe, 1730s. So the first Oligocene cetaceans were discovered in the 1840s, also on a plantation in West Ashley in Charleston, not too far off from where this photo on the left-hand side is. So after the Civil War, there was this large freed labor force and plantations that couldn't rely on slave labor anymore, fortunately. And this guy, Francis Holmes, who was actually he was a slave owner himself up until 1865, and then he had been collecting fossils over the last 20 years, and he realized that there was this business to be had in mining phosphate. And so he started a phosphate mining company, and phosphate mining exploded after the war. And a lot of freedmen went back to work, or rather went to work for the first time, for pay anyway, as part of this phosphate mining business. Half of it was strip mining, so they would dig down about 10 feet to the what are called the Ashley phosphate beds, which are basically a Pleistocene unconformity, an erosional bone bed with large phosphate nodules. You can see in the upper center image there, that's a phosphate nodule that would have been about 1 meter across, and it's fractured halfway. That's my boot for scale. Some of these nodules are enormous, up to about 1.5 meters wide. And the phosphate beds are riddled with megalodon teeth, beaked whale skulls, sperm whale teeth. These are mostly beaked whale skulls and sperm whale teeth on the right-hand side. The work was really dangerous, and predominantly the strip mines were worked by freed African freedmen. The other way was to dredge the river bottoms for phosphate. And you get really large nodules. There's phosphate throughout the rock units here, and phosphate generally forms during periods of low sedimentation. So you get phosphate with kind of really beaten up fossils. You can see the holes in some of these fossils here on the right-hand side. Those are all clam borings. One of the earliest fossils that we attribute to Ankylorhiza is Saurocetus gibbsii. This is the original specimen here. It's a double-rooted tooth. It's kind of like Squalodon, but it doesn't have any cusps on it, and it's got some serrations on the cutting edges and longitudinal fluting. We know there are at least 2 species of Ankylorhiza, but you can't really tell them apart on the basis of isolated teeth. So in the paper, we've declared Saurocetus gibbsii a nomen dubium and re-identified it as Ankylorhiza species indeterminate. A much better fossil, it's still not great, but a much better fossil was found in we think in the 1880s. We actually don't have a collection date for it, but it was found in the bottom of the Wando River during this phosphate or dredging activity. And if you look on the left-hand side, there's a partial rostrum. It's quite large. There are oysters attached to it. These are the little white things, the little white discs stuck to it. And it was originally placed in the genus Squalodon. And the problem is that it was so incomplete that it wasn't really possible to differentiate it from Squalodon until we had more complete fossils. It's quite large. It's even larger than most known Squalodon fossils. These are 2 Squalodon skulls from the Oligomycene of Europe. Squalodon baryensis and Guadalupi. And the teeth are quite a bit different from what's present in the skull here of Ankylorhiza tiedemannii, in that there are many double-rooted teeth. Now, one problem is that there's not much overlap between these. Another issue, and it's plagued paleocetology, actually it still plagues paleocetology, is that anytime over the last 200 years that somebody has found, 150 years, has found a skull of a dolphin that's quite large and heterodont, it's just been arbitrarily tossed in the wastebasket genus Squalodon. And Remington Kellogg, the most famous paleocetologist of the 20th century, he spilled a lot of ink trying to fix this problem. But it wasn't really enough.
That's a new word. That's a new word for me, paleocetology. I haven't heard that one.
So Herman Melville actually has a chapter in Moby Dick called cetology, and it's a term that some whale specializing mammalogists use, kind of, I'm just going to say, fart sniffing. They like to, make themselves sound. Paleocetology really is kind of its own discipline, because we are kind of, we don't really look at teeth a whole lot, and we're obsessed with ear bones. So I use it in sort of a self-deprecating manner most of the time. So a little bit of geology before we continue. Geology here in the Charleston embayment is very complex. This is a cross-section, A to A prime. There's Charleston right there. The cross-section up top is A to A prime. The Chandler Bridge Formation is very thin. This is a late Oligocene rock unit. And the Ashley Formation is much thicker. And this is a sandy limestone unit. They're both about mid-shelf deposition. The Ashley Formation is about 28 to 30 million years old, owing to strontium isotope dates. And I think maybe the dinoflagellate dates are from the Chandler Bridge Formation. Doesn't matter. Chandler Bridge also has a few strontium isotope dates, and in concert with some microfossil dates is a bit younger, 23 to 25. So there's about a 3 to 4 million year gap between the two rock units. This image on the lower right is actually one of the best localities I've ever had the pleasure of collecting at. One of the best exposures. This is a stormwater retention pond that was dug unusually deep. And I spent about 2 days a week here for about 4 months. And I had the danger of moving to a house right as this site was being dug, only about 2 miles away. So I was there a lot. And so this dashed line on the upper right is the Oligocene Pleistocene unconformity, and more or less the inland equivalent of the Ashley phosphate bed. And it is mantled with lots of megalodon teeth, phosphate nodules, etc. And then the Chandler Bridge Formation is really famous locally for producing a lot of shark teeth. So here's an ancestor of megalodon, Carcharicles angustidens. And so anytime you find an exposure of the Chandler Bridge Formation, you can find lots of beautifully preserved shark teeth. I mentioned housing subdivisions being constructed in the 1960s and 1970s. Well, the original skeleton of genus Y, Charleston Museum specimen PV2764, was found in the early 70s by Al Sanders. Butch Dooley considered, in a paper stemming from his PhD work, considered genus Y to be very similar to Squalodon tiedemannii, which led me to take a closer look. So this specimen, before I continue, represents an unnamed species of our new genus Ankylorhiza. And that brings us to this beautiful specimen here, CCNHM 103. It was collected in the late 1990s by C of C alum Mark Havenstein. from the vicinity of Ladson, Goose Creek here in South Carolina. It consists of a nearly complete skull with most of the dentition, most of the vertebral column, a nearly complete flipper, sternum, and some chevrons. And there's some ribs there too, which I forgot to mention. And this specimen's from the Chandler Bridge. And there's a depiction of what we have preserved. So the elements in white are the only elements we don't have any representation of for any specimen. The ones in blue are filled in from other specimens of Ankylorhiza, and everything in red is our specimen alone, CCNHM 103. This skeleton, if you reconstruct or estimate the amount of missing tissue from intervertebral discs, would have been about 5.5 to nearly 6 meters in length, with a requisite scuba diver for scale. Okay, so how do we identify or link these two? How do we link this with Squalodon tebani? So it shares with the original skull from the Wando River, or skull fragment, large size. The tip of the rostrum is actually upturned a little bit, so the dorsal margin is a bit concave. Anteriorly, in dorsal view, the premaxillae widen quite a bit. Most critically, these teeth have very thickened enamel, or sorry, not enamel, cementum, with cementum taking up in some places up to 1/3 of the diameter of the tooth. Most of the teeth have a circular cross-section, which is unusual for a stem Odonnell, and it sort of parallels the condition in sperm whales. And then they have these large embrasure pits, kind of like a terrestrial carnivore, but more of them, since it's a polydont dolphin. And there's a little cluster of foramina in each embrasure pit. We're not really sure what that means, but these are features shared between these two that allow for identification of them as the same species. Unlike CCNHM 103, the Ankylorhiza tebani type specimen was not collected in situ. It was dredged from the bottom of the Wando River, and further examination of the specimen indicates that it's got a little bit of ash deformation matrix in some of the sutures and fractures. So that specimen is actually about 3 or 4 million years older. So we think that this species lived throughout much of the Oligocene epoch. So, and we identify our new specimen, therefore, as a referred specimen of Ankylorhiza tebani. All right, some basic comparisons here. There's a lot of large heterodont dolphins from different localities. My PhD advisor collected this big specimen on the upper left, which is very similar to Phoberodon arcturostris from the Miocene of Argentina. So that specimen on the upper left is an Oligocene New Zealand specimen. We have Phoberodon itself on the center left there, and then on the lower left is Squalodon belenensis from Italy. Our specimen, of course, is on the upper right. And if we compare it with Squalodon and Phoberodon, Phoberodon has a relatively wide vertex, like Squalodon, but unlike Squalodon and similar to Ankylorhiza, it has a very wide base of the rostrum. Neither Phoberodon or Squalodon have any exposure of the parietal at the vertex, which means that their skulls are a little bit more telescoped. And if you look at the blowhole, we'll go into this more in a moment. The blowhole is further forward or closer to the nose in Ankylorhiza because it's got a more primitive stage of cranial telescoping.
Hey, Bobby. I just want to chime in for a second to remind everybody that about now we can start taking questions from the audience. So while you take the minutes you need to finish up this section of your talk, Everyone who's watching, go ahead if you have questions, start putting them in the comments here on Facebook, or if you can on Facebook, head over to the Gray Fossil site, Twitter or Instagram. I'll check those too. And here in a bit, we'll start reading them out for our guests to answer.
Excellent. All right, I'll speed it up a little bit.
No worries.
This is figure 1 from our paper, and it just shows some of the suite of elements preserved in this beautiful skeleton. Skull, vertebral column, teeth, forelimb, and we'll go into some detail on some of these. So if we take a close look at the skull, it's about 1 meter long. It's quite large. It's clearly an Odonnell Seat or echolocating whale because it has these 3 features: a premaxillary foramen, which is the arrow. It has a premaxillary sac fossa, which is associated with the melon. And then it's got this sheet of the maxilla that extends backwards over the orbit. It has limited telescoping. That blue band there is the parietal bone, which is usually not exposed in the skull roof at all in modern dolphins.
Bobby, can you explain what you mean by telescoping?
So if you look at a dog, the bony nares is at the tip of the snout. When you start to develop a blowhole, though, it pulls the bones that surround the bony nares, or the bony part of the nose, backwards with it. So the nasal bones in a dog are approximately about the level of the canines. In Ankylorhiza, the nasals are actually at the level of the eye sockets. And in a bottlenose dolphin, they're behind the eye sockets. So the migration of the blowhole has pulled all those parts of the skull backwards with it. And so the bones themselves, some of the bones don't move. So the bone that encases the eye socket, the frontal bone, stays at where the eye socket is. And all the other bones slide over it over the course of evolution, like a collapsing telescope that a sailor would use in the 19th century. That's the origin of the term.
Thank you.
It's also got really large temporal fossae. So it's got, these are the large windows in the back of the skull for the jaw closing muscles. And then the skull is still mostly symmetrical. All modern Odonnell Seats have a mostly asymmetrical skull, with the right side being a little bit larger, and that's associated with echolocation. Cranial asymmetry in Ankylorhiza is very muted and not represented in the brain case. I will show a little bit of asymmetry here in a minute. It has a few extra tooth positions, so it's starting to be polydont. It has a limited degree of heterodonty, so it has some molar-like teeth, and it has fluted enamel. So it's got these little ridges on the enamel, which are good for puncturing flesh. And then a few little accessory cusps on the teeth. We'll take a closer look at that in a minute. I mentioned cranial asymmetry. So Ankylorhiza has this weird condition where the rostrum is actually twisted about its long axis. And if you're looking at it, it's twisted counterclockwise. We see that in basilosaurids, and we see that slightly in Chironodon, and also in more primitive dolphins like Cotylocar there on the lower right. This is thought to be related to directional hearing versus echolocation, which we know Ankylorhiza was capable of echolocation despite not having an extremely asymmetrical brain case and facial region like a modern dolphin. If we take a closer look at the beautiful teeth of this species, as I mentioned, it has a slight degree of heterodonty. The teeth in the back are a slightly different shape than the teeth in the front. We have one of these cheek teeth here on the center bottom. They have very, very tiny accessory cusps, which are barely even visible in this view, whereas in Squalodon, they're quite large. And then for comparison, we've got that Toothosaurocetus gibbsii on the upper right. These teeth differ from true Squalodon in having smaller cusps and having longitudinally fluted enamel, or having these ridges, versus this sort of rugose, knobby enamel of Squalodon. Most of the teeth are single-rooted, which is why we named it Ankylorhiza, which means fused roots. And among pretty much most stem Odonnocetes of this grade of evolution, certainly amongst Oligocene Odonnocetes, it has an unusually fused suite of teeth. You can infer quite a bit from feeding behavior based on the teeth. So a recent paper talked about fluted enamel in everything from whales to pinnipeds, pliosaurs, other plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, I think even spinosaurids, etc. Fluted enamel is really probably correlated with puncturing flesh and may not have anything to do with point loading. So increasing the amount of force that a tooth can take without breaking. We think in this case, it's likely to help with puncturing thicker skinned prey items. So not necessarily fish, but maybe other marine mammals, sea turtles, seabirds, so on and so forth. There are even some teeth that have serrations on them, which is extremely unusual. We usually think of serrated teeth occurring in things like T-Rex and great white sharks. There's also catastrophic wear on the those procumbent incisors we were talking about, and also on some of the post-canines. So we look at this thing RPC8 on the lower left. That is one of the lower malariform teeth, and it suffered a pretty substantial break at the apex of the tooth, and then that broken surface has been worn down a lot. And then RI1, this is this tooth on either end, that is the lowermost, or sorry, the anterior-most incisor. This is the first tooth in the jaw, and it sticks completely straight out in front, and it is worn down to the gum line. And it seems to have a wear facet that matches the uppermost, the upper anterior-most incisor from the upper dentition. You know, one hypothesis we made in the paper, what can you do with procumbent teeth? Well, you can fight with them, but you can't do a whole lot of biting because they don't point towards each other. They're not antagonizing teeth like these back teeth are. So we hypothesized that they could have been worn down quite a bit like this through ramming. So these animals could have rammed prey to death, which modern dolphins do. Modern bottlenose dolphins kill harbor porpoises for fun, and it's actually like marine mammal murder. They don't eat the harbor porpoises, they just ram them to death for fun. And the paper talking about that named it porpoicide, which is kind of hilarious and sad at the same time. And then one of the last things we talked about supporting this macroraptorial feeding ecology is the degree of movement at the neck. And so if you look at the, if you take the atlas vertebra and you move it around on the back of the skull, the occipital condyles, the range of movement is actually identical, or not identical, but very, very close to killer whales and false killer whales, which shake their prey to death. And then I already mentioned the very large temporal fossae, which house the cavernous jaw closing muscles. So it has powerful bite force as well. So we think that this was an Oligocene killer whale, essentially, or killer dolphin. Hence this reconstruction here, and this reconstruction also shows those fearsome procumbent teeth at the front. Although in this case, about to be used to kill a seabird, not ram anything. So the more important aspect of this paper was what this skeleton means for the evolution of swimming. I'm going to blitz through some of this. Essentially, Ankylorhiza has a humerus in the flipper that is kind of intermediate between a basilosaurid and a modern dolphin. It's got a long muscle attachment crest, and then the humerus itself is still quite long. In most modern cetaceans, the humerus is much shorter than the bones of the forelimb, the radius and ulna. In Ankylorhiza, it's about the same length, whereas in a basilosaurid, the humerus is longer than the forelimb bones. So it's a nice example of a transitional fossil, just in humeral morphology alone. It has long finger bones, so the phalanges and metacarpals are much longer than in modern dolphins. In modern dolphins, they're short and blocky, which help restrict the range of movement. It also probably had synovial it probably had synovial joint capsules in its fingers. Synovial joint capsules are ones that have fluid in them and you can crack your knuckles. I don't know if you could hear that.
Heard it.
But sort of joint capsules don't really occur anymore in modern dolphins. They have the same sort of, I think, the same sort of joint as in the pubic symphysis in your pelvis, fibrocartilage. All right, if we look at the vertebral column, we've got a lot of the vertebrae. Primitive feature that is shared with basilosaurids on the lumbar vertebrae are these transverse processes that are angled down a little bit. If we look in quantified sense, there are gradational changes in proportions from one group of vertebrae to the next. Whereas in modern dolphins, there are much more abrupt changes that are associated with higher velocity swimming. We think Ankylorhiza was swimming a bit like a sperm whale or perhaps like a beaked whale, but not like a rapid swimming bottlenose dolphin. The caudal vertebrae are the same width as, width as height, whereas in a modern dolphin or a modern baleen whale, for that matter, they are much narrower than they are tall, which means that Ankylorhiza didn't have a narrow caudal peduncle or narrow tail stalk. So if you look at a tail fluke right as the whale or dolphin is diving, the tail stalk right in front of the flukes is very narrow, so it can slice vertically up and down through the water with minimal resistance. Ankylorhiza probably had a bulky tail stalk, not unlike a modern dugong, but not as ridiculously wide as a manatee. We hypothesized that earlier based upon a much more partial skeleton of a xenoropid dolphin. So it was nice to have that validated. We also did a principal components analysis to see in what we call morphospace if Ankylorhiza is truly transitional or not. And amongst the vertebrae, slightly. So we've got delphinoids, which are like oceanic dolphins and porpoises in black, beaked whales in blue, sperm whales in green, river dolphins in red and yellow, and then the ancient whales, basilosaurids in gray. And it clusters with the other Odonnell Seats, but is slightly closer to basilosaurids. But if we look at the flipper, it clusters with basilosaurids and beaked whales. And beaked whales have some of the most primitive looking flipper skeletons of modern cetaceans. So that's not necessarily too surprising. Here's a diagram showing the evolution of the flipper. And we've got a sperm whale there on up to the right of Ankylorhiza. To the left of Ankylorhiza is Dorodon, a basilosaurid whale. And then a modern white-sided dolphin, Lagonarhynchus, on the right-hand side. Like modern cetaceans, Ankylorhiza has a fixed elbow. It cannot move its elbow. The humerus radius ulna joint is fixed, whereas in Dorodon, it can still move quite a bit. Like Dorodon and unlike modern cetaceans, the finger bones are quite long, which is interesting because how do you make a long hydrofoil like flipper if you can't add any new digits? So if you look at Lagonarhynchus, it's got many, many, many more finger bones than we do, or that Dorodon had for that matter. So we think one of the early ways that basilosaurids and early dolphins could make a long flipper is just by lengthening the digits. And then later they evolved hyperphalangy, which is the condition of having more phalanges than the primitive number. Got to talk about phylogeny for a few minutes. So I'm going to gloss over a lot of this. So cetacea, that's all baleen whales, Odonnoseats, and Archaeoseat whales. That's that yellow blip there. Red is Neocetes, so Neocete is the baleen whale plus Odonnoseat clade. And then Odonnoseat is right there. And so Xenorophidae is that little triangle. Those are the earliest echolocating dolphins. And then Chylorhiza is there. And then what's cut off at the bottom is a sperm whale, which is the most primitive. I'm using that word simply out of its utility. There's a large number of extinct species between Ankylorhiza and a sperm whale. So it is on the Odontoseat stem. And most importantly, it is nowhere near Squalodon. So it's another reason why we erected a new genus. And there are two species of Ankylorhiza. CCNHM 220 and 103 are Ankylorhiza tiedemanni. The other two specimens in our analysis, Al Sanders' specimen and another skull, those represent another species we get to name later. Don't really need to talk about that. What we do need to talk about, though, is what this phylogeny means for the evolution of postcranial features. So features we see in modern Odonnoseats and baleen whales that we assumed evolved in the common ancestor are not present in Ankylorhiza, which means a lot of these evolved completely in parallel. So for example, having over 24 caudal vertebrae must have evolved independently in some modern dolphins and some modern mysticetes. The narrow caudal peduncle, so that's the narrow tailstock, that must have also evolved in parallel. The evolution of horizontal processes on the side of the lumbar, the lower back vertebrae, that must have evolved twice. And a few features of the humerus. So the interesting thing here is to think about why evolve so many features convergently. Our best hypothesis so far is that once you lock the elbow at the onset of the evolution of Neocete, you can no longer go back to like flapping with your forelimbs like a sea lion. And we're not sure if that was ever used amongst early cetaceans, but once that elbow's locked, you're pretty much restricted to using the forelimb as a hydrofoil. And yeah, it can generate some lift, but it's mostly going to be used for steering. And all the propulsive force is then provided by the tail flukes. So once you're locked in like that, even if you diverge into two groups, like the baleen whales and the Odonnoseats, you pretty much have to swim in the same way. So we see a lot of parallelism now that we incorporate this really complete early dolphin skeleton into this phylogenetic analysis. All right, so to conclude, the species is a lot earlier diverging than Squalodon, so doesn't belong in that genus anymore, is now Ankylorhiza tiedemanni. It is a large killer dolphin based on dentition, size of the jaw muscles, body size, and then neck mobility as well. And then this mix of derived and primitive features of the postcranial skeleton means that there is rampant convergent evolution between baleen whales and echolocating whales in terms of their swimming adaptations. I'd like to thank National Science Foundation, Sarah, Matt, and Jesse at our museum and Charleston Museum, folks at AMNH and the Smithsonian. I'd like to especially thank the late Al Sanders and especially Mark Havenstein for collecting this fossil, Mace Brown for putting it together, and other folks. And there's our Instagram and Twitter tags right there. And especially thank ETSU and Great Fossil Site for putting this on. Thanks a bunch, guys. And I hope there's still plenty of time for questions.
Thank you, Bobby. We do have quite a few questions coming in. David, if you want to get started.
Sure thing. Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes or so for questions, I think. So I'm going to go through some of these and pick out some questions for you to answer. So let's see. Martin has asked, at what point can you tell a cetacean is a dolphin in the fossil record? For example, what are the key features to look for?
Let's see. The first thing I look for, and this is not a phylogenetic character, but generally speaking, if I was out digging, size. So dolphins get very small very early. That doesn't help for things like Ankylorhiza. So to use a real scientific feature, generally speaking, the ear bones look very different. But the most easy to understand parts of the skull, if you have these dish-like features on the premaxilla, which is one of the bones on the snout, there will be this dish-like feature that I highlighted very briefly in one slide called the premaxillary sac fossa. And what that houses, if you do a necropsy of a modern dolphin like I've done in New Zealand, you can stick your finger down there and actually feel it. It's called the premaxillary sac, which houses the nasal plug, which closes up the blowhole during diving. And that feature is unique to dolphins. And it evolves very early on. Also having a big foramen in the premaxilla just in front of that. Unfortunately, what that means is if you find a vertebra or an isolated tooth, depending upon which locality you are in, you may not really be able to tell the difference between fragmentary early baleen whales and fragmentary dolphins. For example, in the Pacific Northwest, most of the baleen whales are very small, dolphin-sized, and some of the dolphins are larger than the baleen whales. And the teeth, in some cases, look identical. So, and if you find vertebrae and nothing else, you're totally hosed. So the real answer is it's complicated.
Gotcha. Speaking of identifying species, Sharon and the Mammoth Site interns have submitted the question, can you describe how cetacean ear bones are measured to identify species?
Oh God, that's a dangerous question. Only because I could talk about this for hours and bore everybody to tears. Let's see, the biggest difference, if you want to talk about, leading on from the last question, the biggest difference between early dolphin and early baleen whale ear bones is also size. So early baleen whale ear bones are about 1.5 times the size of early dolphin ear bones. Now, how to tell individual species apart, that's usually going to rely on having sort of a mental image library of what all these things look like. And it's going to be differences in the position of little bumps and ridges and holes and fissures and grooves. Every time I see a new ear bone, I feel just as dumb as I did 10 years ago when I started trying to learn these things. So there's an extremely steep learning curve, and I keep on realizing every time I answer questions on Facebook about identifying ear bones, I really need to write a big, long blog post about my mental process and lots of figures and stuff like that. But it's there's no easy short answer on how to identify ear bones. But bumps and ridges and holes and stuff like that.
Gotcha. Sarah asks, do you have a favorite book or textbook or resource that would be good for young adults who are interested in learning more about extinct marine mammals?
The go-to would be Marine Mammals Evolutionary Biology by Annalisa Berta. And Berta et al. And there's the third edition came out in 2015. So that's pretty up to date. And there is a more popular abridged version of that is not, that's technically actually a textbook Annalisa has written another one. I forget the exact name of, but it's got a beautiful ray troll illustration on the cover. Either of those, depending upon how scholarly or popular you want to go, either of those is a great introduction to marine mammal evolution and paleontology.
Excellent. Cam asks, what drew you into
Hi,
studying
Cam.
whales?
What drew me to what?
To studying whales.
Actually, there's an answer Cam is really going to like. And a lot of any amateur collectors who are tuning in. When I was a sophomore in high school, I went digging for shark teeth in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and people would pull out shark teeth. There were a bunch of us at the site, and we were screening for teeth, and everybody would know what genus and species. That's Isurus hastalis, Isurus planus, etc. And somebody pulled out a sea cow molar, and nobody knew what the genus and species was. And I was like, well, why is that? And I'm like, I don't know. And I started looking into it more, and it turns out that at that point, there had only been like 3 or 4 paleontologists who had living, still publishing papers on West Coast marine mammal paleontology. And there were a lot of papers, and I'm not going to throw any particulars under the bus, but there were a lot of scientific studies started by a paleontologist in Southern California who just never finished them. And so I took it upon me, once I started researching the Parissima formation, I took it upon me to start clearing out this backlog. And I'm still doing it slowly. My priority here in South Carolina is studying South Carolina fossils, but I'm still putting out at least 1 paper a year on these Northern California marine mammals. So largely it was because of the other paleontologists not really communicating their science effectively to the avocational community. And I knew that needed to change. And once I started collecting more and more marine mammals, I realized how big of a Sisyphusian task it was, and that just drew me in more. But here I am, still drowning.
Here's a question from Aaron, one of our former students here at ETSU. Do cetaceans go through deciduous and permanent sets of teeth the way other mammals do?
That is a wonderful question. And if that's Aaron Woodruff, how's it going, Aaron?
Yep.
So we know that archaeocetes had deciduous teeth. There are fossils of some basilar sword whales where they've actually, they died in the process of shedding their deciduous teeth. So they have deciduous molars and erupting permanent teeth. Modern dolphins only develop 1 set of teeth. And modern baleen whales actually do develop teeth, but they are resorbed during field development. Now, the problem is that when you only have 1 set of teeth, we don't know what set that is. So there's this sort of low-key debate that's been going on for the last 10 years or so. What set of teeth do modern whales have? And was 1 set lost at the base of Neosete or independently within baleen whales and Odonnell Seats? So I've been searching high and low for a dolphin with milk and adult teeth. Haven't found it yet, which might tell me eventually if we have a good enough sample of 1 species. If you have a good enough sample of 1 species and a bunch of different ages represented, ontogenetic growth stages, I mean, and you only find the same tooth shape, that's probably good evidence that early Odonnell Seats, like modern Odonnell Seats, only have 1 set of teeth. Now, with Coronodon, when we published Coronodon, we hypothesized that because the adult teeth of Coronodon look like the milk teeth of a basilosaurid whale, we hypothesized that modern cetaceans have lost the permanent dentition, and then the deciduous dentition has actually turned into their permanent dentition. So that would be tooth loss through paedomorphosis or neoteny. I always get them mixed up.
Interesting.
That's only a hypothesis, and so far nobody's found any fossils that can really test it. So somebody needs to go out there and find a really good sample of early Odonnell Seats through a wide number of growth stages showing two distinct tooth types, or all one tooth type, therefore demonstrating one hypothesis with the other. Now, here's the catch. If you find a population of early dolphins where all the little ones have a different shaped tooth than all the bigger ones, a lot of paleontologists would name them as two different species. So this whole thing is also a circular reasoning trap. That is an excellent question.
Thanks for that one, Aaron. We are getting on time, so I'm going to go ahead and ask this one more question. This is a question, actually, Martin and John have both asked a version of this question, which is basically, what was the paleoecology and lifestyle of Ankylorhiza? What would you say is the closest living comparison?
We think something a bit like a killer whale, or perhaps a false killer whale, is most likely. We have no idea if Ankylorhiza was capable of cooperative hunting, and nobody's ever going to find that out. I don't think, unless there's some ingenious guesswork is done. Great, but I don't think there's any way to infer cooperative hunting from a skull. But based upon the dentition and the jaw size and the neck mobility, we think killer whale-like feeding is most likely, and quite frankly, is probably capable of eating whatever it wanted. And killer whales, of course, just like hyenas, if they cooperatively hunt, they can take down something much bigger than themselves. Killer whales frequently kill baleen whales, although they'll often lazily go after babies, which are still bigger than them. And so there's fascinating, tragic, and marginally horrifying footage of killer whales drowning gray whale calves by just going up and sitting on top of their heads and preventing them from breathing. So, and then killer whales just eat the tongue and then leave the rest of the carcass to rot. So there's a lot of cat-like cruelty in modern oceanic dolphin hunting behavior, as I already mentioned with porpoiside. So there's no reason to think Ankylorhiza wasn't capable of cooperative hunting, though there's no evidence in favor of it either.
And do you think the bite force would have been higher than in an orca?
Based solely upon, if you look at the ratio of the temporal fossa size to the size of the skull, in a relative rather than absolute fashion, yes.
All right. Well, we better wrap it up there. Anything else you want to add, Bobby, before we head out here?
The last thing I will add is that fossils like this are uncovered by local amateur collectors all the time, and there's no place on the East Coast where amateur paleontologists have such a capacity to make scientifically significant contributions to paleontology. So for all the amateur collectors tuning in right now, happy hunting. Please give us a call if you find a skeleton in the ground. It could be something important, and local collectors have a serious capacity for finding new species here.
All right. Thank you, Bobby, and thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks a bunch, y'all. Much obliged.